Okay, let's do this, shall we? If you can see the monstrous amounts of dust collecting on my shelves behind me, no, you can't. Just don't worry about it, okay? No one said getting your master's doesn't come without some sort of sacrifice. Hi, I'm Maddie. I am here to yap about whether authors are truly the authors of their texts. And you might be thinking, well, of course they're the authors of their own texts. And I'm here to say, well, yes, but also no. So, in other words, maybe. Let me explain. I have 6 pages of notes. This video is never going to end. You're going to be here for 2 hours. I hope you're ready for that. Authors write their texts, right? Obviously. But the writing of a text doesn't always equate to the meaning behind a text. Because like any form of communication, books are a dialogue between two people, the author and the reader. The author's intent behind a text doesn't always match what the reader will interpret that text to mean. We may have an author say one thing about their texts only for the readers to have a wildly different interpretation of it. So which of these should get more importance? Which one should we listen to? Some argue that since it's the author's work, we should take their word on what their texts mean, while others argue that the impact of a text is way more important than the intention behind the text, so we should take the reader's interpretation of that text. And we may have variations of this view depending on what kind of writing we're dealing with. For example, autobiographies and memoirs might be weighed with more authorial intent, since we see those pieces as closer to the author. It is their life experience being depicted, after all. In contrast, however, we have fiction, which we may place closer to the reader, especially if the work is highly symbolic and metaphorical, and therefore open to multiple interpretations. But then we have this tricky genre called the roman à clef, some French word that I don't fully know how to pronounce, but I'm going to try my best. This genre sits in between fact and fiction, and I argue that it points out what is true of every genre. The author is always both present and absent from their own texts. To demonstrate this, I'd like to use Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, and Pete Wentz' roman à clef novel, Gray. Roland Barthes' essay, The Death of the Author, was published in 1968. In it, he talks about how we place too much importance on the character of the author rather than the actual story. He argues that placing so much importance on the author limits the text. To quote, he says, "To give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text, to furnish it with a final signified, to close the writing." He argues against this highly individualized view of writing, even going so far as to say that it is language which speaks, not the author, saying that we all take from this public system of writing and it is never an individual person that is writing any story. To give the author ultimate importance on what their text means goes against the very nature that he sees language operating in. So instead of giving importance to the author, Barthes argues that we should give more importance to the reader. He states that a text is made of multiple writings, drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation, but there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader, not, as was hitherto said, the author. So in Roland Barthes' view, we should discredit the author altogether. It is the reader that gives life to a text. But then I came across this article by Carly Aaron Watts called Roland Barthes' Resurrection of the Author and Redemption of Biography. They see The Death of the Author as satire. What? It was fake? The whole time? They see Barthes as reacting against the new critical ideal that authorial intent does not have any weight to a text's meaning. They state that by the 1960s, the notion that biographical factors could be disregarded by critics was already widespread. And at last, in 1968, Roland Barthes brilliantly challenged this labor-saving new orthodoxy by using a very traditional method, the method of satire. Holy crap, I've been lied to my entire academic career. They view him in line with satiricist Jonathan Swift, author of A Modest Proposal and Gulliver's Travels. That's a hard word for Elmo. Be proud of me. Normally I can't say that title. They state that just as Swift's narrators would carry a satiricized idea from the starting point of plausibility to a climax of derangement, so the fictional narrator created by Barthes is characterized as one whose dementia breaks through the initially plausible guise. This point of dementia is reached when he says that by refusing to assign meaning meaning to a text, we liberate an activity that is truly revolutionary, since to refuse to fix meaning is, in the end, to refuse God and his hypostases, reason, science, law. The narrator is now revealed as a deranged atheist, one whose attack on the literary author is really an attack on the ultimate author, God, and his derangement is made explicit by his desire to deny reason itself. That is quite the heavy-handed critique. So now we're dealing with a text that's not really about asserting that the reader is more important than the writer. We're dealing with a text that is making fun of people who believe readers are more important than the writer. Some textual evidence that Carlier and Watts bring forth includes the contradictory claims that Barthes makes throughout his article. He states that author intent is not important, but then a page later investigates Proust's biography to talk about the meaning behind one of his works. Barthes also signs this essay, claiming authorship over an essay that is trying to do the exact opposite. So Carlier and Watts proposed that the opposite is actually intended from Death of the Author. Authorial intent is important to the text. It is not possible to read a text without thinking about its author. So is Death of the Author serious, or is it satire? Is it a cop-out to say it's both? This leads me to a second article I found, this one by Alistair Hurd. Hurd argues that underneath everything, we still care about authorship, even if we try to pretend that we don't. Hurd analyzes the writings of Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and Samuel Beckett, and makes the case that each of these authors, to varying degrees, all argue that authorial intent is important. To do this, Hurd investigates Barthes and Beckett's writing in particular and shows how they include personal details of their lives in their texts. So even if they explicitly say that they don't care about authorship, their text is still pointing to themselves, indicating a pretty clear connection between text and author. Hurd talks about the death of the author and the allusions Barthes makes to his colleagues Kristeva and Bakhtin. They state that Barthes is deliberately, yet covertly, laying down an intertextual line for his reader to follow through Kristeva to Bakhtin. That he does so whilst avoiding any direct reference to specific terms such as intertextuality, or even mentioning his colleague by name, suggests an attempt to create deeply embedded intertext. The article's author is wielding a significant directive influence over the multiplicity delivered to the reader by packing additional submerged intertext into the article. The result is a text that reveals the still present author attempting to create the illusion of his own demise. So maybe Barthes isn't being satirical. Maybe he is. Maybe he doesn't know the contradictions within his own essay. Maybe by having his essay be read both as satire and as a serious text demonstrates this blurry line between author and reader. So is it death of the author or life of the author? What should we take from this ominous essay? Once again, is it a cop-out to say that I think it's both? I think it's both. It's both. It's both. And in particular, the roman-à-clef genre exposes and celebrates this fine line. The third article I found is called Genre Trouble by Ravit Reichman. In it, they talk about the roman-à-clef novel, which is French for a novel with a key. This genre sits in between both fact and fiction, where authors write about their real-life experiences while concealing the real names of people, places, or events that would lead the story into a true autobiography or memoir. In other words, there are enough clues for the reader to piece together what is fact and what is fiction if they know much about the author, but there may not be enough to get a full picture. The result is this sense of undecidability in a text. As Reichman says, what rings true for some appears as fiction to others. And this is the fine line that the roman-à-clef loves to mess around with. I was going to say straddle, and that felt too forward. Don't psychoanalyze me. The genre is designed to scatter just enough breadcrumbs to lead the better informed among us to the individuals behind the fiction. As they state, the roman-à-clef's strategic containment grew out of the deeply held literary conviction developed over the 19th century and consolidated in the 20th, that a work of art should exist in an autonomous relationship to life. It's tied to our desire for gossip and to make connections to the real world and events and people, even while we are in fictional stories. Reichman states that writers use a wide variety of roman à clef. Some clues are fairly obvious, some are not. It's not easy to tell what is truly fabricated, what is partially fabricated, or what is not fabricated at all. A few famous works that are considered to be in this genre include The Bell Jar, On the Road, Tender is the Night, and The Sun Also Rises. If I were a normal person, I may have picked one of these books, but I'm not, so my pick for the roman à clef is Pete Wentz's novel Gray. Pete Wentz is the bassist and lyricist for the band Fall Out Boy, aka my biggest obsession ever, my love, the thing that keeps me going, really my everything. And this novel is a roman à clef because it perfectly sits in between both fact and fiction. So many of the events in the book mirror Wentz's life. For example, the unnamed narrator is in a band. This band, which is also unnamed, follows Fall Out Boy's trajectory into fame. Told from the first-person perspective of this unnamed narrator, it is mentioned in the book that we learn that while Nirvana recorded a bunch of songs for Nevermind in the studio we're in, just one actually ended up on the album, Polly, in case you were wondering. Names in the book are omitted or changed, but undeniably refer to real people. For example, there's a character called Martin, who is the lead singer of the band in the book, which happens to be the middle name of the lead singer of Fall Out Boy, Patrick Martin Stump. There is also a depiction of Andy Hurley, who is the drummer of Fall Out Boy. Again, the book doesn't mention him by name, but it does state that we have a new drummer now, a masher from Milwaukee. He's got more tattoos than the rest of us put together, is a militant, straight-edge vegan, and is always ready to fight because of that. He has a shock of red hair, and when he gets going behind the kit, he reminds us all of Animal, which is what we start calling him. Needless to say, our shows get a little more interesting. If nothing else, this depiction is the clearest argument that this book is a roman à clef. Some argue it's a memoir. I'm not willing to go that far personally, but it is undeniable that the animal is Andy. But even with all these details, the story is also clearly fictionalized. Once again, the names are changed. We are being given clues that the lead singer is Pete, that Martin is Patrick, that the animal is Andy, that the band is Fall Out Boy, that the albums they are recording are Fall Out Boy's first 3 releases, and yet by omitting this information, by not naming these things directly, we're being denied confirmation that these are indeed the facts. And there are inconsistencies throughout the novels. For example, one of my favorite moments happens when the book says, "We're standing on the balcony, the animal and me drinking Tall Boys." Since this scene is them at a party, I'm assuming that Tall Boys are referencing some sort of alcohol. But earlier in the book, it is mentioned that the animal is a straight-edge vegan. Andy Hurley has talked about in real life being a straight-edge vegan, and therefore would not be drinking. There are also other events that do not exactly match Wentz's life. This is morbid, but the character does attempt to take his own life in the book, but these details do not match Wentz's own attempt. The book also includes fantastical elements. In other words, some things clearly did not happen or could not have happened. In addition, this is a little beside the point, but this is one of the most confusing narratives I have ever read in my entire life. The story is not told chronologically. The novel begins basically at the end of the plot. It is largely stream of consciousness, where chapters will skip timelines without any warning. There are hardly any indications of when time is passing or what period of the narrator's life we are in. We're constantly on watch, needing to pay close attention if we want to make any sense of what is happening. So on the one hand, the book is telling us to look closely and to pay attention if we want to make sense of anything. But on the other hand, he is also one of the most unreliable narrators. He constantly contradicts himself. He's hypocritical. He's completely unself-aware while being hyper-aware somehow. He will acknowledge when he's in the wrong to the audience, but won't apologize to the person he's wronged. And then a page later will complain to the audience that he was wronged. So the novel warns us against taking the narrator at his word. We're being told to look closely, but also to look with a grain of salt. We can't trust everything that the narrator tells us. Another reason this can't be autobiographical is the fact that Pete Wentz is not the only person who wrote this book. It is co-written by James Montgomery, and it is important that he is not a ghostwriter, but a co-author. So we have two people writing one Romana Clay. Overall, we have a book that is based off of key events of Wentz's life and personal relationships, written by himself, but also not written by himself and not based off of key events of his life. Do you see how confusing that is? The author's personality is underlaid throughout the entire book, but he's also not completely there. He is a ghost haunting the text at every point. I fully realize that the quotes I'm about to share is just confirmation that if you are looking to find something in a text, then you will find it. In other words, these are heavily taken out of context, but if we look at them through the lens that this book is playing around with the Romana Clay genre, these quotes are quite fascinating. It's mentioned that this is a giant production now. This is when the narrator is talking about how he always feels like he's wearing a mask, that he always is playing a part in a larger role. In other words, the narrator's real life has been turned into a performance. Interesting if we think of this as a Romana Clay. The hardest part of watching someone watching me is making it appear that I'm not watching. I just feel like this is a clever way of acknowledging that the reader is reading the author's story, but also saying that the author is watching the reader read their story, and so they're aware that they are going to be perceived, and that's going to affect how the text is written. You know what I'm saying? Romana Clay, what can I say? My pen was a life raft in the middle of the ocean. It was the only place I could ever be free. Grammar and punctuation were just someone else's ownership over my words, so I raged against them, blew through borders, made them mine. I would keep all my secrets inside parentheses. I would hold my breath before every period. Hello, Roland Barthes and his theory that language is just a public system. What a perfect way to encapsulate the idea that you are going to take that public system back. Am I reaching too far? I don't care. I love it. I find it interesting. Sometimes I am willing to believe in anything if it means ignoring the reality of a situation. In other words, is this saying that we are willing to believe in anything even if it's not true, like how we are willing to believe that a Romana Clay is a memoir or autobiography even if it's not, or if we're willing to believe that fictional stories are truly fictionalized and not based off of the author's real life experiences? Do you see where I'm going with this? I don't know. All of this just shouts Romana Clay to me, and that's what I want to believe, so you're on this journey with me now. You're forced to. With all of that being said, I argue that the structure of Grey, the way the story is bound by Pete Wentz's life, but also carefully omits key information that would bring us confirmation that it is, and the way that the text is haunted by its author while also keeping that author concealed, is not special to this book or the Romana Clay genre. In every literary genre, we see glimpses of the author, however translucent or opaque these glimpses are. We see it in memoir and fiction and poetry and songs and essays, no matter how biographical or fantastical the text is. Like I said in the beginning, the amount we see of the author will depend on what kind of genre we're dealing with. Autobiography may sit closest to the author, but there is still the possibility that we will misinterpret the text as readers. The dialogue between writer and reader may be disrupted anywhere along the text. In fictionalized text, we may not be able to see the author behind highly surrealist stories or language or narratives with unreliable narrators, or at least we may hope that we don't see the author too clearly in some, but their views and their personalities influence their texts nonetheless. We may see Roland Barthes himself in the death of the author, even when he argues against us doing so. Or we may not see him at all, and what would it mean for either of those things to be true? What would it mean if Grey is a serious personal history of Pete Wentz's life? What would it mean if it is instead a parody of a memoir, a Romana Clay that is making fun of readers for wanting to know more about its author? This is a source of tension in every piece of text ever written, because there is that dialogue between writer and reader that will never 100% be a pure communication. Hello, Derrida, you weren't supposed to be in this video, but you showed up anyway. In every piece of literature, the author haunts their texts. They are never truly alive in the words, but they are never truly separated from it either. You can't exorcise them away, but you also can't invite them to be among the living. Okay, I'm done with my metaphors. I'm done with my symbolism. I'm done with my fancy speech. Okay, you can go home now. The ghost of the author. Get it? That's what this was leading to. It's a ghost. Boo. Spooky, scary. I also had that when I was talking about the translucent and opaque glimpses. I hope you really like that. That was purposeful. That was purposeful. I did that on purpose. Just please someone appreciate it. There is so much in this that I could talk about. I could yap for days, okay? Lindsay Lohan is in this book. Like, but she's not because they don't call her Lindsay Lohan. But like if you put two and two together, like she's in the book, they talk about her and like who's the disaster? That I've never been able to figure out. I'm truly lost in the sauce when it comes to Fall Out Boy. Well, I think that will do it. I only have like 3 hours of footage. It's not that bad. I only have like 90 minutes or something, which is still a lot. Yeah, I should edit that. Okay. Bye.